Please welcome Co-Director of the Center for Maximum Potential Building Systems, Gail Vittori.
Good morning. It's such a pleasure to be here with everyone and talking about this really important issue of how building transformation equates to human transformation. This has been an area that I've had a privilege and opportunity to work on for about the last 20 years. It's been a continuing journey and adventure and discovery process that I think many of us are on. And certainly it's something that has emerged as becoming part of our everyday lexicon as we talk about buildings and performance and understanding how the decisions that we make every day are so influential in human health and the broader public health outcomes. Just curious in terms of the folks who are in the room, how many of you are in the healthcare profession? See some familiar faces out there. Hello, Whitney and others. How many of you are in the built environment profession? I think between those two questions, we have every person's hand risen. Many of us who have been doing this work and those who are observing it have acknowledged that in many ways the work related to the built environment is extraordinarily influential of human and public health. How we build, what we build with, where we build, all become extraordinarily definitive determinants of human health. And I think in some ways, and this has been acknowledged by others, we all, in a sense, are public health practitioners. So how do we take that responsibility on in our everyday decisions? How do we acknowledge that the decisions we make every day are actually influencing people's health? We can think about that in a number of ways. One is to learn that there are definitive and defined now relationships between decisions we make and health outcomes. Certainly we have a long ways to go, and we're learning as we go. We are also cognizant of life cycle thinking as we make those decisions. Often what is invisible is as important as what is visible. So how do we bring that information to bear to our everyday decisions and challenge ourselves to see what is not easily visible and have that information be as informing of our decisions as what is readily visible. Thirdly, and this is something that I learned from my experience with the Green Guide for Healthcare, that some of you in the room have had affiliation with, is that the decisions that we make influence at three scales. One is the scale of the building occupants, and certainly we have reason to be very cognizant of those relationships. The second is the next scale, of community and regional, and how decisions that we make influence at that next scale. And thirdly, on the global scale, how does our understanding global challenges that face us today can be improved and informed by the decisions we make inside our walls? So this three-scalar view of consequence, I think, is one that has been important as we have an opportunity to guide our decisions with health promotion and prevention really underpinning. And I think that that is part of what the dialogue needs to really be focusing on. And I think we will learn a lot from our two speakers today in helping us get a better understanding of the spectrum of activity now that is defining the realm of human health. Let me first introduce Kathy Gerwig, someone whom I've known for well over a decade now and have had an opportunity to work with. Kathy is responsible for developing, organizing, and managing a national environmental initiative for Kaiser Permanente. Kathy has testified twice to the U.S. Congress on the need for federal chemical policy reform. She serves on the board of multiple nonprofit organizations focused on safety and sustainability in healthcare and is responsible for eliminating workplace injuries, promoting healthy lifestyle choices, and reducing health risks for Kaiser Permanente's 200,000 employees and physicians. Her book, Greening Healthcare, How Hospitals Can Heal the Planet, if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it, examines the intersection between healthcare and environmental stewardship. Please let us welcome Kathy Gerwig. Next is the privilege to introduce Julia Africa. Julia leads the ecological infrastructure, biophilic design, and restorative landscape areas of nature, health, and the built environment program at the Harvard School of Public Health. She examines the ways in which nature and natural design elements in urban settings influence psychological and physiological health and resilience. She also holds a master's degree actually in design studies from the Harvard Graduate School of Design. She is a member of the steering committee for the Biophilic Cities Network and is on the board of the International Society of Nature and Forest Medicine. Please welcome with me Julia Africa. So we're going to try to not stumble off these stools early in the morning. So this is really such a treat for me. This is, I think, really a way that we can begin to further the dialogue, really operating almost on a span of the spectrum that is about health and the built environment. So when we think about buildings, there's really a lot more to buildings than just the buildings themselves. They're all of the consequences that I had mentioned, upstream and downstream, the relationship to the natural environment, and we're going to be able to explore some of those stretching of our view of health and the built environment today with both Kathy and Julia. So for Kathy, Kaiser Permanente has certainly been such a leading voice in beginning to define what those opportunities are, and specifically with Kaiser being both an insurer on the one hand and a health provider on the other, enormous footprint both in terms of your staff and your the people who you serve, and your physical footprint as well. So how do you view health promotion as part of and intrinsic to Kaiser Permanente's mission in the way that you define it now, and how it has guided making your decisions relative to the built environment and the opportunities that you see inherent in that?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Gail. Delighted to be here and delighted to be able to talk with Julia and Gail this morning and all of you. Just in terms of what has attracted me to this topic of health promotion and the built environment, I grew up in a family of geographers and medical doctors, and spent my childhood in West Virginia with firsthand view of how the environment impacts people's lives as well as their health. I also spent my teen years in Santa Barbara shortly after the devastating oil spill there, where once again I saw how decisions about energy and health and environment interrelate, and what resilient communities actually looks like. So, geographers think about people and places, and doctors think about people and health. And so at Kaiser Permanente, we think about people, we think about places, and we think about health. So it really has been an opportunity to work across all of those realms. And I guess, the common thread through it all is around preventive health, which means the further you go upstream to deal with a health issue, then the better off everybody is. That's true with preventing diabetes. It's true with preventing chemical exposures. It's true as we look at sources of energy and what it's doing to the planet. So that's how I think about health promotion from a preventive lens, and I'm looking forward to talking more about that.
And Julia, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this work.
Good morning. I'm also grateful to be here on stage with these wonderful ladies and with you here this morning. I'm from Berkeley, California, and I grew up in love with plants. That was all I ever wanted to think about. I've been fortunate to have a variety of different professional incarnations for that passion. I started off as a cultural anthropologist. I was interested in ethnobotany, the way that people use plants in cultural settings to address various medical issues. I went to a graduate school program for acupuncture and oriental medicine, so I became a licensed Chinese herbalist. It's a different way of using plants in a very specific historical context. But I found that very satisfying, and I worked in Boston health clinics with patients ranging from AIDS-related disorders to infertility. I moved on from that to the Harvard School of Public Health, where I was able to take that interest in plants and return to an earlier but less well-satisfied ambition, which was to think about phytoremediation the use of plants to address urban contaminants in the air, soil, and water, but at the urban scale. So I went from the scale of treating the patient to treating the city. And that was really very satisfying. I wasn't able to engage in that work at Harvard, but I was able to look at how we think about environmental exposure assessment and how it is those plants can be incorporated in our lives to help improve our health. And from there, I then went to the Harvard Graduate School of Design and finally told my family it would be my last graduate degree, and they believed me. It's been true so far. But I have a Master in Design Studies wherein I continued my interest in plant-based remediation through phytofiltration, which is the use of HVAC-integrated living walls. It's the use of a living wall wherein the air is taken in through the actual plant material into a charcoal plenum and filtered of various VOCs. And that was super. And in the context of doing that research for my master's degree, I stumbled upon the literature on biophilic design and various other psychosomatic effects associated to exposure to plants. And from there came this current moment in my career wherein I get to talk with people about what it means to have those plants in your environment, either in the built environment setting, the natural design cues within the built environment, or landscape design features which are thought to promote specific health outcomes.
So that's fascinating, and it's interesting that the early work of E.O. Wilson from Harvard on biophilia really getting that discipline constructed and how it's influenced so many decisions. Also noting the early work of researchers in the healthcare field that have begun to connect the dots. Roger Ulrich's work, for example, way back in 1984, acknowledging the relationship of patient outcomes relative to those with a view of trees and landscape versus those with only a view to a wall, and how it influenced the length of stay for those patients. So we have really now a legacy of beginning to understand how to shape our indoor environments so that we get the benefit of the connection to nature. Kathy, I just want to go back, and you've described your early years and things you were exposed to, and talked a little bit about prevention and health promotion. And again, as an insurer and a healthcare provider, looking at the opportunity to look at the upstream as a way to be a source of prevention and health promotion. What do you see, how do you see that being shaped at Kaiser and some of the tools and resources that you've brought to bear and really help to lead the healthcare industry in many ways in those regards?
Yeah. Thanks, Gail. I think the best way to answer that is to talk about one of our facilities in particular, because it really embraces a lot of these aspects, and that's a medical office building in Antelope Valley, which is near Lancaster. So maybe, an hour and a half away from here. And here's what's special about Antelope Valley. It's a lower socioeconomic area. It's in the high desert. When I was there recently, there were wind gusts of over 50 miles an hour, and that's a regular occurrence. Wind can be up to 80 miles an hour. And they had a particular need, not for general health care, but for some complicated health care for people with multiple chronic conditions. And so Kaiser Permanente built a facility there that is so visually exciting. It has, to address the geography and the wind patterns, it has an undulating glass wall that's just beautiful. It has art that reflects the nature of the area. It's a place where monarch butterflies migrate. And so you see lots of versions of butterflies around in art and sculptures and in themes that carry out throughout the building. It has places that blur the lines between the community and the facility. So walking paths, an amphitheater outside, a little sand pit for kids to play in. There's just a welcoming feel about this place that sits a little bit up on a hill. And it really exudes health through connections with nature, and when you walk in, you feel like you're going to get some pretty high-class health care, which is in fact what happens inside the building. It's a LEED Gold building. It has all kinds of features with lighting, and one of the things I like most is that it is the only healthcare building, I think, in California that uses gray water in the ground floor group bathroom, and that was because the city wanted to take advantage of a treatment area nearby, and they actually worked with us on the piping. So unlike many places where they would shy away from something that innovative, this was a community that felt like this is an opportunity to be innovative, and it's worked out really well. When I was visiting recently, I was talking to a community member, and she said, when this opened, we felt like Kaiser Permanente gave us a civic center. And I thought that really says it all, because that's what, to me, the innovation of this is you blur the lines. What is healthcare? Well, it's really about health. And to the extent that the built environment, especially in healthcare, can be about health overall, and then you get great healthcare when you're there, that is something that I reflect on. Only 10% of what determines our health is actual provision of medical care. The rest of what determines our health is primarily around personal behaviors, social and environmental factors, genetic factors, and so a healthcare organization like Kaiser Permanente isn't limited to just that 10% medical care piece, when we can do something like strengthen a whole community because of how we chose to build out a facility, is an example of really thinking about it from a health lens as opposed to a healthcare lens.
Yeah, fabulous. And I was doing some research recently and saw that the statistic now for chronic diseases is 86% of total healthcare expenditures. Only a few years ago, it was 75%. So somehow, over the course of just a couple years, we've increased that percentage to 86%. And I think, again, looking at the upstream opportunities to shift that so that, what do we do, how do we make decisions every day that are actually beginning to move that needle in the other direction. Okay. And fascinating, too, I think, in terms of underserved communities that have so often been without not just access, but places of quality where the delivery of care can also be so benefited from the environment that it exists in. And so, with Julia, I think the biophilia is as part of what becomes an influence on human behavior, well-being, productivity. It is extraordinarily influential with that, but it also brings with it some co-benefits in terms of how it's designed and how the natural system and the way we work, like the stormwater system that you're talking about, gray water system, comes in and becomes an asset as opposed to something we have to just deal with downstream. How have you found, Julia, the opportunity to sort of weave in a co-benefit structure for the biophilic design features that have become now much more emblematic of the buildings that we're defining as green and resilient?
It's a great question, and the Civic Center compliment that you received is really the gold standard. It speaks to the kind of integration that you want in any project, and I think biophilic design is not separate from that. I think when done badly, it can take the form of a few potted plants in the corner of a room, but of course that's not what we're going for. And anyone who's listened to the wonderful seminars and work produced by people like Bill Browning and Vivian Lofness and Steve Kellert, all of whom and many others have been excellent at defining how holistic the environment needs to be in terms of its reception of green design features. I don't know if the slide is up. Not yet. Oh, it's not up yet. There it is. I was in Norway this summer and I took this photo on the edge of a river. And one thing that it reminded me of is everything old is new again. Here we talk about biophilic design as a sort of top-down approach of various design features segmented out, 14, 17, 20 different features. But for most of recorded history, it's just been the way that we've lived. And I think it's worthwhile to understand that it's also often talked about as being something which is rooted in evolution and biology. From Eric Fromm and from E.O. Wilson, we have so much wonderful language speaking to the ways in which these are instincts, this affinity, this innate affinity for nature is within us, but it also has certain cultural and historical narratives that influence how the design applications work best. And I think that's always useful to remember in the context of designing these facilities for health. Next slide. It's not coming. Oh, there it is. This is not my work. This is Tim Beatley's work from the University of Virginia. You'll know him from the Biophilic Cities Network if this is a type of discussion that you follow. But I find this diagram extremely helpful because he talked about how the best application of biophilic design in our cities would be at every scale of the urban experience, from those moments that you have as soon as you walk out of your door, potentially from within your home, but as soon as you walk out of your door on your way to work, the regional moments that you maybe have weekly when you go to peri-urban parks or parks within the city, and then rather less common experiences, monthly or yearly exposures to more wildlands that take more effort to get to, but provide different amenities. And I think a diagram like this helps us remember that when considering this idea of dose response, we have many different areas of our lives, many different moments of our lives in which we can insert the biophilic design experience to help improve our health outcomes. And to speak to that a little bit, I've used this diagram here, sorry. This is a diagram from Japan. How many of you are aware of their forest bathing programs, the Shinrin-yuku? Just a few hands going up, just to say that across the archipelago there are maybe 50 or 60 different forest therapy centers where one can go to have a therapeutic experience in the forest. And what's remarkable about this, and because we're beginning to have nature prescription programs in this country too, but what's remarkable about what's being done in Japan, and should perhaps serve as a model for what we might do here, is that one can go to, if you look at the bottom left-hand corner of this image, one can go to the company doctor and say, well, you know, here are my symptoms, I'm feeling stressed, my blood pressure is up, et cetera, et cetera. The doctor can take note of this and refer you through a company-sponsored wellness program, subsidizing your transport, subsidizing your lodging, to a forest therapy center somewhere proximal to wherever it is that you work. And you can go there for a few days, you can take hikes, there are wellness checks where they'll do nutritional counseling, there'll be holistic therapies, whatever you need. Not everyone who goes to these forest therapy centers is affiliated with a company, but what's remarkable is that these companies extend this amenity as part of their care for their employees. And we don't, to my knowledge, really have anything like that in the US at the moment. It may be coming. I know there's a lot of interest in the CDC and the Pan American Health Organization and the National Park Service in finding ways to integrate our natural amenities with the provision of healthcare in this country. I think it's a field which has a lot of room to grow, but we'll need to find the way to do it in an American context, which makes sense. This is what works for Japan, and that's not going to be necessarily what works for the US. There are some very specific factors which determine why a company chooses to have a relationship with a particular forest therapy site. Maybe the CEO is from that prefecture. Maybe they take materials from that area of Japan. So there's an embeddedness of this relationship that makes it work in this context. And to those co-benefits that Gail alluded to, most of the studies concern stress, mental health, and well-being, and those are certainly very important to look at. We are limited in some ways to studying short-term health benefits, one can say. We don't have a sense necessarily of what the long-term benefit of repeated exposure to a natural environment is. We can make certain assumptions. We are getting a better sense of how those exposure mechanisms work, particularly with respect to changes in the microbiome, the human microbiome. So those are the microbiota that live on the surface of your skin, inside your nasal cavity, inside your gut. And when you look at shifts in the diversity of microbial flora on those areas of the body, some shifts have been linked to inflammatory responses, and some inflammatory responses do have mental health outcomes. That is, if you have someone who has an inflammatory response that is particularly severe, it may have a particular diagnosis, a psychiatric diagnosis associated with it. So a more diverse microbial flora may actually attenuate that mental health problem. This is not research that I do myself, but it's research that I'm aware of. We look at how natural exposures then increase someone's generalized health by essentially changing the biota in their body. So that's just one mechanism that we're exploring for how these exposures to nature might benefit people.
We also know that there are ways that these nature-based integrated systems into our buildings can be performing more than one function. You've talked about how the influence on the human body is one way to do that, but we also know that there are ways to design these systems so they both provide the connection and visual exposure to nature, but they also have a performative function, like in stormwater design. And I know, Kathy, one of your facilities in California has, I'm recalling, was motivated because of a municipal reality of having an overstressed stormwater infrastructure. And so the response became a decentralized approach to that, which also introduced a lot more nature-based amenities on what's often, for healthcare, just an ocean of parking. And just, how you saw that process go through, and I think, Julia, you've also had some experience with that. So let's just hear from Kathy on if you can share some knowledge with that.
Yeah, I think you might be referring to the Modesto facility and the way that instead of just having a regular, kind of parking area, that it would be porous and retain much more of rainwater. But actually, as I was listening to Julia, the place that I was thinking about more is we have a medical office building and a new hospital complex, but this was the medical office building in Oakland, California, which is extremely urban and a tight space, and it was all cement and culverts, and that's just how that area was. And now when you go there, there is a stream that was basically reborn. So taking it out of a culvert, bringing it back up to the surface, creating a garden around it, a thriving garden, and that is part of a walking area, not a walking path, but a walking area that has lots of little private benches that have greenery around them, living plants. So as you are thinking about the procedure that you're going to have, or somebody that you're visiting in the hospital, or something usually that's giving you anxiety, if you're at a medical center, frequently people are emotionally tested. This is a place where nature provides part of the healing. It's very intentional that exposure to nature is part of what that built environment can offer people in terms of their mental health and wellness, as well as physical health. And now when you visit that area, I mean, birds are in that little garden that hadn't been there for decades before that. And I think about in your book, Gail, and the work you've done with Robin Gunther, and this idea of regenerative green buildings. It's not just that they're not doing harm, it's that they're actually doing something better. And I think about that stream, and I think that is a perfect example of creating a better environment than the one that existed before, very much centered around health.
Yeah, great story. Thank you for sharing that. And Julia, you, I think in the Boston area, had talked about an integration of stormwater management systems with some of the biophilic interventions. Perhaps I misunderstood that from a previous conversation.
Unfortunately,
I could be.
yeah. I'm wondering what you're referring to. I wish I knew. But I mean, of course, it wouldn't be news to the audience, of course, that there's a layered ecological infrastructure, that we can have psychosomatic benefits and engineering benefits from our green interventions.
Right.
Can I speak to
sure,
something,
of course.
Sophie? So to your point about this garden that you were mentioning, it turns out that people are terrible judges of biodiversity, but that certain signaling factors in the environment, the presence of birds and bird song, principally water also, and the complexity of flora, that is the different sorts of textures and sizes of greenery, signal biodiversity to people. And if they don't have those factors, they may be a less good judge of how robust that environment is. But the presence of a biodiverse environment as a respite is more salutogenic, more health promoting than a non-biodiverse one. That is, if you're going to design one of these moments in a facility where people can walk around and sort of take a sense of refuge or reflect on the whatever troubles or stresses they may be experiencing, the ability to signal that complexity in the environment ends up being more healthy than not.
There's a great story. Robin Gunther, someone who many of us know in the audience and on the stage, co-author of the book that I wrote with her, Sustainable Healthcare Architecture, she tells a great story of a hospital project in Boston, the Spaulding Rehab Hospital. And it was one that was in design and begun to be very influenced by resilience strategies. And one of the attributes that they wanted to integrate into the building design was operable windows. And this apparently was on the cutting board many times through value engineering because it's not appropriate. You don't have hospitals that have operable windows. There were cost issues. And what really turned it at the end of the day, as I understand it, is that in engaging patients and healthcare providers in the building to be part of the final decision, the comment was made, if we can't open our windows, we can't hear the birds and we can't hear the water. This is a hospital that's located right on the Boston Harbor. And that apparently turned the decision because of exactly as Julia was describing, and many of us know intuitively, it actually does make a difference, and it does give us a sense of relief from stress and connection with something that's bigger than us.
But also on the subject of Spaulding, the other remarkable thing is, of course, that they raised the floor grade many feet, basically, to accommodate projected sea level rise. And one of the things that having these ecological or engineering infrastructure intervention signals to your occupants is that you're prepared for what's coming. And that in itself is something that I don't think people talk about all that much, but it does relieve stress in its own way. Not relieve stress, but it does address stress. It raises to the level of a conversational piece the fact that there are some very significant changes in our atmosphere and in our environment that are happening, and that your facility is willing to accept that and understand that sea level rise is something that they're addressing through, the provision of this wetland or a berm or raising the building structure. I mean, that's important. And that says to your employees that you're looking after a future that they will have to contend with too.
Do you mind if I just build on that
Absolutely.
for a second? Because it is part of, we're installing solar panels, we're doing a lot with renewables, but and a piece of that is on-site solar. And one of the interesting things is how you communicate with the community and the membership that visits your facility when you're going through a construction effort, and it's solar. And we took the opportunity to have it be a health message that Kaiser Permanente is concerned about climate change. It has health consequences that we're already seeing today, and the solar that is maybe inconveniencing your parking at the moment is actually all part of that focus around health. So I think it is part of what you're saying, Julia, is around communicating that we appreciate that there are there could be devastating consequences to no action around climate change. And here's an example in your own neighborhood, in a facility you're visiting, that is taking a stand around that. So.
Absolutely, and that's a great segue into sort of a general question, which is, years ago I encountered the definition of the World Health Organization of what health is. And so the World Health Organization defines health as the complete state of physical, mental, and social well-being, not just the absence of sickness and infirmity. And so when you think about it in that context, it's really this layering of one is not enough. Physical health without social and mental well-being is a deficient state of overall health. And how does that, sort of in the broadest sense, health for all and getting ourselves really in a construct of thinking about health for all, not just health for those who have the privilege of having easy access to it, understanding the relationship of the decisions we make have consequences for people that are outside of our direct sphere of influence. How are we creating this sort of uber opportunity to create conditions conducive for health, as one way to think about that. And in a sense of I think, a political climate where equity is part of the conversation right now, what do you both of you see as opportunities to really embed that way of thinking into the decisions that you're able to influence in your work and inform?
Yeah. Well, I mentioned preventive medicine earlier, and that really is the stake in the ground, I think, in answering this question, Gail, because so at Kaiser Permanente, preventive medicine means that we're going to track your blood sugar, and if it starts to get elevated, we are going to come in with everything we have to try to turn the tide on that, because it's better for everybody, including the planet, if you stop a disease from happening as opposed to wait until it converts to diabetes and then people have lifelong conditions as a result that are, by the way, very taxing on nature's resources. So it's that philosophy around preventive medicine that has guided our work on the environmental side, because if you're worried, if on one hand we're treating cases of cancer and on the other hand we're using materials that contain carcinogens, then that's a problem. So how do you go upstream? How do you help prevent cases of cancer? Well, you stop exposing people to carcinogens wherever they may be, not just in our facilities, but in the whole supply chain process. And so that has guided our work around our safer products work that began years ago as we looked at PVC and the connection between PVC and dioxin pollution, and wanting to move away from that, everything from flooring to the exam gloves we use to wall coverings, roofing materials, et cetera. And so just a couple of quick examples of how we have gone upstream on this preventive approach. A couple of years ago, because of a regulatory change in California, probably many of you know that no longer were upholstered furnishings required to have chemical flame retardants in them. It wasn't a prohibition on those chemicals, but it was permission to manufacturers to have alternatives other than chemical flame retardants in the furniture. So when that regulation changed, Kaiser Permanente used our voice as a purchaser, a major purchaser, to say we're no longer going to buy furniture that contains chemical flame retardants. And we communicated that internally to our suppliers, but lo and behold, within a week, we were getting calls from the New York Times and lots of other media outlets. And so we had a press conference to talk about why we made the decision. And first, it was for two reasons. One is it turned out the flame retardants didn't actually do what they were supposed to do in terms of fire prevention, and it turned out that they were toxic. So those two things made us say, we're going to take a different path here. You can have furniture that's perfectly safe in a healthcare environment and not contain dangerous chemicals. And more recently, this year, we did something kind of similar with antimicrobials. There has been a move to put antimicrobial chemicals into everything from, elevator buttons to carpet to really everything. And rather than that preventing infection, it turns out that when that global use of antimicrobials is actually harming humans' ability to withstand disease. And that, coupled with there are also some concerns about those chemicals and the exposure to them, caused us to say, once again, the furniture and building materials, we don't want antimicrobials in that, as well as soaps, lotions, all of those other things. And yet we're in a healthcare environment. Infection prevention is foremost on our list. So we're not shying away from infection prevention, but it turns out when you think about antimicrobials and soap, regular soap and water is just as effective at killing germs as the stuff that contains, say, triclosan. And triclosan is a chemical that has some health concerns. So it's, and I have lots of other examples, but that's one way that we look at prevention upstream to actions we can take in the way we build buildings and the way that we use chemicals and the way we source products, to work with the innovative manufacturers to say there's got to be health at the center of what we're doing here, and we've seen that play out many times.
And I think you're describing something that has been underpinning a lot of the work in material health right now. And as you described, for antibacterials, you're not only having equal effect, but you're not having any of the adverse consequences going back to just soap and hot water. Some of these things, I think, as we dissect what are the root causes of some of the things that we see having adverse outcomes, there's often very simple solutions. And sometimes it's going back to basics, which gets us positioned in a way on the foundational construct of much more aligned with a sense of overall health. So, and again, I think the work Kaiser's done has been a leading voice for others in healthcare and beyond, because you are such a large organization. And so I think in my research, looking at healthcare and how trends are established, what you've done has just been fabulous. And so Julia, similarly with looking at this intersection of physical, mental, and social well-being, I think a lot of what you described with the connection to nature and some of the direct health benefits is a way to begin to reestablish a sense of planning and almost a pattern language of how we think about designing our environment so that a broad public gets the benefits of nature connection. And how have you seen how that's been playing out?
I think there's increasing interplay between landscape architects, urban planners, and public health clinicians and practitioners who are interested in finding the places where their work corresponds and where their work can be synergistic, mutually amplifying. And the sentence that comes up for me, I don't know if the term climate refugia is at all familiar to this audience, but it's a term that refers to ecological settings that are relatively resilient to the effects of climate change. That is, there's relatively little movement of species and animals. There's relatively little disturbance. And so the word for an ecology which has been disturbed, it's perturbance, right? So in my mind, the sentence goes something like, is perturbance to ecologists what allostatic load is to public health clinicians? In public health, we have this term allostasis to refer to the wear and tear on the body that comes from stress, the degree to which, over a course of a lifetime, through various insults, whatever they may be, your blood pressure does not return to normal, your heart rate stays elevated, you are unable to manage physiologically the burden of the stressors to which you're being exposed. You are like an ecology out of whack. So when we find those places which are climate refugia, when we find those moments in the ecology that are for whatever reason stable, perhaps there are lessons we can learn from them, or perhaps those are places that we need to have a greater integration with as a population, because they will be more stable refuges for our population, which is under great threat, really. Changes in nutritional quality of foods, availability of resources. I don't need to list it out. Everyone in the room knows it. So in a sense, it's how as public health clinicians, we are always at the forefront of translation. I think landscape architects are some of our best companions in that effort, because I think their profession, more than many that I'm aware of, seems to be taking up the challenge. And speaking of taking up the challenges, I would be remiss if I didn't notice give a nod to my colleague in the room, Joe Allen, who's there with a table of his students in the corner. They're doing remarkable work on materials chemistry and building management. You're probably familiar with his work in the COG-FX study. He'll be speaking later today at 3:30. Please go. So their group and their website, forhealth.org, helps display some of the remarkable work that he and his students are doing at the Center for Health and the Global Environment on just these sorts of issues. That is, how can we run our buildings better and healthier for everyone?
Fantastic, and welcome, Joe, and your students here. Really fantastic work. So just a final question before we open up for Q&A, the folks in the audience here. Part of what's been challenging with the work of understanding the relationship between human health and the environment is a sense of uncertainty. If we do this, then will that happen? And I think many of us have been faced with questions about how to quantify the results and the outcomes that are expected from investing in things like operable windows or healing gardens in hospitals or a much more abundant landscape or healthier materials that maybe are newer to the market and therefore have some price premium to them. And yet we know that there's a lot of progress that's been made. And so my question to Kathy and Julia is, given this context of uncertainty, that is in many ways the lack of empirical evidence, but certainly I think a lot of us would say a weight of evidence that would lead us to a health-promoting, preventive-based decision. How have you continued to make progress? And what have you considered to be some of the big obstacles and maybe some ways that you've been able to overcome them would be really great to hear.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm just thinking about last year on the lead up to the Paris climate talks, and the Lancet came out with another study on climate change and had this really shocking finding, which was that climate change and other environmental hazards are undermining 50 years of progress in public health. So think about all the advances in public health globally over the last 5 decades, and then look at what climate change is doing to that, undermining that. We're going backwards, not forwards. And if, I mean, that's the definition of uncertainty, because it really causes us to think very differently about remedies. And so the other thing, I went to a talk here yesterday, I don't know if others made it. Sebastian Copeland, one of the polar researchers, gave a really sobering talk, and he was telling us about the thawing of the permafrost and how that is accelerating. And when the permafrost thaws, much greater levels of methane are released, methane being a much more toxic greenhouse gas emission than CO2. So his message was, even with what happened in Paris, and we should be celebrating this week that China and India, the US and Europe came together to realize what needed to happen to really cement the Paris climate deal. That's fantastic. And there are a lot of people, including the speaker yesterday, who say, we have no idea. The IPCC predictions about climate change, even the worst case scenarios, are maybe understated, because as the methane gets released, it could very severely accelerate the rate that climate changes. So there we are with that kind of uncertainty. And so one way to try to address that is, and I'll give you an example at Kaiser Permanente, and Rami, if you could go ahead and show the slide. The way that we're addressing it is to say, what are the goals we should have that are commensurate with the size of the problem? And when it comes to climate change, our goal for 2025 is that we will be net carbon positive. What that means is we'll go beyond being carbon neutral. We're going to take more bite out of the problem than just our own culpability and go further. As far-reaching as this goal is for an organization our size, I think we're one of the few organizations that has gone this bold with a climate change goal. It's only scope 1 and 2 emissions. Scope 3 emissions, meaning our entire supply chain, is where probably another 60, 75% of our emissions are being generated. So it goes to show that the magnitude of the problem requires a leap of faith in how we're going to get there. That goal and the other goals that you see, we have 7 goals for 2025. Many are related to climate. We have a waste goal, a food goal, et cetera. We actually don't know how we're going to achieve these goals. So we're accepting uncertainty in our own organization because we must have goals that are commensurate with the problem, and the problem is about health. I mean, climate change is not an environmental problem. It's a global health problem. And if we don't address it effectively, there will be a severe price to pay. So wanted to share this as just in that realm of uncertainty and ambiguity. There's a little bit of a moonshot approach that we're saying it's time to take that moonshot and figure it out along the way. We've had bold goals in the past, and by setting them, we've been able to achieve them. Why would this be any different? We've got to figure it out.
So there's really a powerful message, I think, in terms of setting bold goals and having that be the stimulus that really infuses a sense of innovation and opportunity. Yeah. And then checking in and seeing how you're doing along the way. And certainly things aren't static out there. And so how do you pay attention to what's working and what's not working, particularly in a large organization? I think it's a sort of strategy that hopefully is something that other organizations, large and small, are understanding their opportunity to set that high bar and then infuse a new path that really is responsive to the challenges that we all face. And Julia, certainly in the work of biophilia and nature connection, similarly a sense of uncertainty. How do we really know? And going back to the Roger Ulrich study in 1984, that kind of was a marker. It continues to be raised as sort of setting in pace, along with some of the other early work of E.O. Wilson and others, that there is this relationship. Yet I think there's still kind of a pushback of how do we know? Do we know enough to actually move forward and begin to have that way of thinking about the relationship between nature and the built environment become much more of the way we do that work?
Yeah, there's a tremendous need for more evidence and quantified evidence, so that people can go to their board of directors, that they can go to their company, and they can say, well, these are the anticipated improvements that you can expect in cognitive performance and health outcomes and self-rated well-being, and this is what it means in economic terms. It's not that people are callous or craven exactly, it's just that they have accountability, and that's a serious thing. In the research community, it's our job to use all of the new technologies that come out to take better measurements of how it is that people respond to features in their environment, and to try and triangulate down to which design features or which types of ecologies or which types of exposures are most impactful. That might change how we use our urban parks. That might change how we use our biophilic design interventions in corporate campuses and in small neighborhoods. And to that point, around uncertainty, we'll go from the example of marvelous corporate leadership to something that's a little more in the nitty-gritty. With climate change, there are tremendous changes afoot in plant physiology. Growing seasons are extended. Pollen counts are expected to increase. And irritants in some plants are expected to increase, so more dermatological disorders. There's the potential that with elevated carbon in the atmosphere, this is very much the nitty-gritty, but plants will have different gas exchange rates, because as they grow larger, they have larger leaf surface area, but if there's more carbon dioxide in the environment, as there is in, for instance, in an indoor setting, oftentimes if it's not well ventilated, what you have is a plant that doesn't need to exchange as much gas to get the food that it needs, right? So it downregulates gas exchange, which means it's basically accepting less carbon dioxide from the environment. You have a plant that's effectively removing less carbon dioxide from the environment. There are changes afoot in how plants are responding to our environment. And so when we make these decisions about, particularly, biophilic design is not just about putting plants inside a building, obviously. There are a lot of different layered elements to doing it well. But to the extent that it involves building these design interventions that include plants, we need to be cognizant of the fact that the plants are not responding to the environment in the way that they used to. Phytoremediation cannot proceed on the same assumptions that it has proceeded with for the last 50 or 60 years. Plants are simply not behaving the way that it used to. So that's something, an uncertainty that I think we have to be vigilant about. We have to keep doing the research and doing the monitoring of our remediation sites and of our building sites to make sure that the plants are doing what we think they're doing.
And I think part of what is also important is tracking the outcomes. As we begin to make some changes in the way we think about the design strategies that we incorporate, what is the outcome? What are we learning from those? Are they hitting the level of effectiveness that we thought? Are there other unintended consequences? How are we collectively engaging in a transition to a pattern language about the way we build and how we build and the design features that we integrate that is really, truly about prevention and health promotion? And I think we all have an opportunity to be part of that conversation and that research and creating the body of evidence that's saying, we know more now than we did before, and it's starting to reshape the way that we all are able to benefit from. So with that, it's been a lot of information. It's just been fascinating, and I just am so thrilled that both Kathy and Julia were able to be here for this panel this morning. But I want to open it up to the audience, and Whitney's hand is up. I think there's a mic there and there that I see. And we'll have, I think, about 5 minutes for some Q&A.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the inspiration and leadership on this panel this morning. So, Whitney Austin Gray with Well. I would love to raise a conversation around mental health and the built environment. So 1 out of 2 people are dealing with mental health issues in their lifetimes. That's you or someone you love. You talked a lot about everything from toxic exposures to nature walks and mental health. And I just really want to raise a lot of more awareness to the issue, and I'd just love to hear some comments. Kathy, you have an amazing program about workplace health and what you're doing for your workers and for patients in mental health. And I just would be kind of appreciative of your comments on where you are at in supporting the issues around mental health for all the panelists.
Thank you, Whitney.
Sure. Well, what I would say is there's a whole lot of opportunity, to put it politely, around the issue of mental health as it relates to environment and environmental degradation in particular. I mean, there's been a lot of thoughtful work coming out around the mental stress that goes along with climate change, everything from sort of trauma that because of severe events and flooding and fires, to the sort of overwhelming nature of hopelessness for people who feel like there isn't a way to address climate change. And I think we're at the nascent stages of trying to address those issues from a mental health standpoint, particularly in healthcare, where when you look at mental health and wellness, like a lot of things, you go for the highest risk. We're talking about substance abuse and clinical depression, and a lot of focus on that. And where we need to go more to, I think, is prevention, as we've been saying. We get that really clearly on physical health and maybe not so much on mental health. So I would just say it's an area that we're just starting to explore, and a lot of work ahead.
Yeah, I think it is an area also where there's a lot of interest that I'm seeing, and there are two different things that came up for me with your question. One is that I, in the last year, had the opportunity to work in a setting, an open office plan setting that is very dense and can be sensorially challenging, and it, as many open office plans are.
I'm going to write that one down.
And to a certain extent, those intervals, whether it's an atrium or a walk on the grounds outside, those intervals of less sensory stimulation or decompression can really be extremely useful, and particularly in a healthcare setting where people have such extreme stressors, it's quite necessary. I've also participated in design charrettes for mental hospitals, both times actually. The designs that came out of those always incorporated a lot of natural elements, and not because of my advocacy, because the design teams understood from the feedback they were getting from the clinicians that in that specific clinical setting, which I understand is different than the majority of the population that you're talking about, but in a particularly needy population, the use of natural design features and views to the outside were considered to reduce the rate of aggressive restraints and lower rates of medication. So it's not just the gallbladder surgery study that Ulrich did that everyone refers to. I think it's meaningful for mental health in a significant way.
Absolutely, and we know circadian rhythm is something that, excuse me, is increasingly being studied as a determinant of stress reduction. We have a question over here.
The question is about living things indoor in general. We've been seeing animals, including humans, if you put them indoor in confined environment, they tend to live longer, but oftentimes develop chronic diseases. Does the plants will do the same if you put them indoor? Do they actually will behave like the animals indoor? Number one. Number two is, we've been also finding out having plants indoor can potentially generate more VOC, and especially if you have a lot of air blowing through it, it's not so clear that the PM10 and PM2.5 trapped in the plant is actually staying there. Can you address this idea of living organism indoor in general? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Great question. Maybe a little on the technical side for most of the people here, but I do appreciate it. Do I have 6 seconds? Is that right?
I think we're approaching the end, so go ahead.
And very briefly, to your question A, how do the plants respond to living indoors? Well, it depends on how you maintain them. The reason why a lot of living walls fail is because they're not properly looked after. These are things which require a lot of interventions. They require a lot of water and food and the proper lighting. And if you don't take care of the plants, yes, they will develop diseases. Not necessarily, the analogy for chronic disease is not necessarily useful, but all living things need to be looked after. Plants are no exception. And to your question about PM2.5 and particulates and VOCs, that is a longer conversation, what is true is that the leaf surface texture and the leaf surface electrostatic condition and the humidity on the surface of the leaf determine a lot of what the leaf will pick up out of the air. So you have some control over those design features. You don't have control over everything. A leaf does not necessarily, in its stomata, accept airborne particulates. The stomata is engineered to accept carbon dioxide as a source of food, so it may re-emit things that you may see it either emitting things on its own or re-emitting things that it's taken into the stomata. Most of the filtration that's attributed to plants is actually a function of contaminant streams which are brought at a particular air speed through the soil structure of the plant, because it's thought that the root surface hairs and the microorganisms along the root surfaces are the ones that are actually doing the degradation of indoor contaminants. So if it's a function of the PM 2.5 or PM5 not going down, I mean, those things should really be addressed by your HVAC system, your building ventilation system. They should be addressed by a charcoal plenum. When you're using plant-based filtration technology, you should probably be trying to use it for VOCs instead. There are some new technologies coming out for VOC reduction because the plant system it's possible to have it work. It's also finicky. It has to be well maintained, and a lot of the ones that fail are just not engineered properly. That's my understanding. But in any case, a longer conversation, I'd be happy to talk with you afterwards. And I think we probably have to end.
Right, and with that, yes, unfortunately, our time is over. Thank you so much to Kathy and Julia. Thank you all for being here with us this morning.